Margot's fingers trembled as she slid the heavy brass key into the rusted lock of P.O. Box 402. A secret her husband had kept buried behind his smiles and silk ties for years. The dry screech of metal on metal echoed through the empty post office lobby, sounding like a physical wound. Inside sat a thick stack of envelopes bound by a single tight rubber band. Not the investment portfolios Ben had promised would save them, but high-interest debt notices and private bank statements from accounts she didn't know existed. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe, smelling of cold adhesive and old paper, as the reality of a 30-year life began to fray at the edges. Back at the shop, the rhythmic hum of her sewing machine usually provided a sanctuary. But today, the needle moved with a frantic, stuttering pace as she stared at a pile of unpaid rent notices on her desk. The bell above the door jingled, and Ben walked in, his presence filling the room with a practiced, easy warmth that now felt like a suffocating shroud. He reached out to pat her hand, his touch familiar and reassuring, while the hidden key in her pocket burned against her skin. Margo looked into the eyes of the man she thought she knew and realized she wasn't just facing a financial ruin. She was standing in the shadow of a stranger who had already sold the floor beneath her feet. The bell above the door jingled with a familiar, thin resonance, a sound that usually anchored Margo Hensley to the floorboards of her life. In the heart of Lancaster County, the air inside the shop always held a specific weight, a mixture of fresh-pressed cotton, the sharp tang of starch, and the lingering sweetness of dried lavender sachets tucked into the corners of the shelves. Margo let her hand linger on a stack of patchwork quilts, her calloused fingertips tracing the rhythmic rise and fall of the stitches. There was a profound, quiet strength in the flannel, a softness that belied the thousands of tiny punctures required to hold the layers together. Morning light spilled through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in golden shafts like silent spectators to her routine. She reached out to smooth a stubborn crease on a display piece, an Ohio star pattern she had finished only last week, and adjusted the open sign with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of an Amish buggy's wooden wheels against the gravel provided the morning's metronome, a sound that spoke of a world that refused to hurry. Margo inhaled deeply, drawing the scent of clean fabric into her lungs, and began the meditative task of aligning thread spools by color. Each cylinder of silk and polyester clicked into place, a tiny soldier in her textile fortress, shielding her from the vague, persistent anxieties that had begun to nibble at the edges of her sleep. The peace of the morning, however, was a fragile veneer. As the sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the polished oak of her counting desk, Margo felt the gravity of the leather-bound ledger calling to her. She sat, the chair creaking under her weight, and opened the book to the pages marked with the aggressive scarlet of unpaid debts. Her fingers, usually so nimble with a needle, froze over the columns. The rent for the storefront had ballooned over 3 months into a figure that seemed to pulse on the page, a predatory animal waiting to strike. She bit her lower lip, feeling the faint, rhythmic throb of a vein in her temple. The paper beneath her hand felt damp. She reached for the calculator, her thumb striking the plastic keys with a dry, rhythmic staccato as she ran the numbers for the 4th time that hour. The remaining balance on the current account stared back at her, cold and unyielding. Numbers possessed a brutal honesty that fabric lacked. You couldn't stretch a dollar the way you could stretch a bias-cut strip of calico. A cold sweat broke across her palms, leaving faint, blurred patches on the yellowed reports, evidence of a panic she refused to voice even to the empty room. The shop door swung wide, shattering the silence and bringing with it the bracing scent of the winter air and the rich, roasted aroma of black coffee. Ben stepped inside, his presence filling the small space with an easy, practiced warmth. He moved toward her with the confidence of a man who owned the air he breathed, draped an arm over her shoulders, and pressed a quick, distracted kiss to the crown of her head. Margo didn't look up, her fingers still pointing at the red ink. "Ben, the arrears. We're over the line." He didn't even glance at the ledger. Instead, he gave a non-committal wave of his hand, his face breaking into that wide, effortless smile that had won her over 30 years ago. "Margo, honey, stop squinting at those dusty books. You'll give yourself a headache before noon." His voice was a smooth baritone, a comforting weight that sought to push her worries back into the shadows. He patted her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "The investment portfolios are doing the heavy lifting now. We're seeing growth every day that'll make this little rent hiccup look like pocket change. Trust the process." She looked into his pale eyes, searching for a flicker of the hesitation she felt in her own bones. But he only winked and adjusted his silk tie in the reflection of the glass casing. For a fleeting second, his certainty acted as a balm, allowing the knots in her shoulders to loosen. She wanted to believe him. She wanted the world to be as simple as he made it sound. A series of upward curves on a graph she didn't quite understand, but he mastered. That afternoon, Margo found herself standing before the imposing glass and steel facade of the local bank, her reflection looking smaller and more frayed than she felt. She smoothed her skirt and adjusted the collar of her blouse, a nervous habit that did little to settle the frantic beating of her heart. Inside, the bank smelled of lemon wax and the sterile, metallic scent of a currency. She clutched a folder containing her business plan, a vision for the future that involved computerized long-arm quilting machines capable of intricate designs that would draw collectors from across the state. While she waited for her appointment, she watched the second hand of the wall clock sweep with agonizing deliberation. In her mind, she could already hear the rhythmic hum of the new machines, seeing them breathe life back into the shop's declining sales. When the credit officer finally beckoned her, she sat in the deep leather chair, spreading out photographs of her best work like offerings on an altar. Her voice gained strength as she spoke of the tourism potential in Lancaster and the heritage of the craft, her eyes bright with the desperate hope of a woman trying to sew her life back together. The officer, however, did not share her fervor. He took off his glasses, wiped them with a slow, methodical motion, and pushed her beautiful photographs aside as if they were nothing more than scrap paper. His voice was a dry rasp of bureaucracy. "Mrs. Hensley, the passion for your craft is evident, but the bank requires more than aesthetic potential. To move forward with a loan of this magnitude, we need additional collateral." He tapped a pen against a printed form. "We'll need the original title deed to the residential property, and more importantly, the certified statements from the joint investment accounts your husband mentioned. Our preliminary check shows some inconsistencies in the reported balances." Margo felt the air leave the room. Her mouth went dry, the taste of copper rising on her tongue. "Inconsistencies?" she managed to whisper, her fingers fumbling with the strap of her handbag. The officer didn't look up. He merely highlighted several lines on the application with a fluorescent yellow marker that looked like a wound on the page. "Just the paperwork, Mrs. Hensley. Bring those in, and we can conduct a formal review." She nodded, though her head felt disconnected from her neck. She tried to offer a word of thanks, but it died in her throat, a stillborn thought. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead seemed to bleach the color from her skin as she stood, her legs feeling like unspun wool. That night, the Hensley house was a tomb of secrets. Margo lay in bed, listening to the rhythmic, heavy breathing of Ben in the room above. He had taken to sleeping in the guest room lately, citing his late-night trading sessions. She waited until the house settled into that profound silence that only comes at 3 in the morning, then crept down the stairs. She gripped the banister, her knuckles white, praying the old wood wouldn't betray her with a groan. In Ben's home office, the air was stale, thick with the scent of old tobacco and the lingering ghost of his expensive cologne. She knelt before the small floor safe, hidden behind a deceptive stack of leather-bound biographies. Her breath came in shallow hitches. She entered the code, a sequence she had glimpsed over his shoulder months ago, a secret he thought was his alone. The heavy thud of the bolt retracting sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. With a trembling hand, she pulled the door back, the light from her phone trembling across the contents. She saw stacks of blue folders, insurance policies, and tax records. She began to sift through them, her ears straining for any sound of movement from the floor above. Every rustle of paper felt like a roar. Deep within a stack of mundane insurance riders, her fingers brushed against something small and hard. She pulled out a velvet-lined pouch and shook the contents into her palm. A heavy brass key with a stamped number fell out, attached to a tag from the Lancaster post office. It was registered to Ben Hensley, but the address wasn't their home. It was a P.O. box she had never heard of. A cold, sharp needle of suspicion pierced her chest. They had a mailbox at the end of their driveway. They had lived there for 20 years. Why would Ben need a private box in town? She gripped the key until the metal bit into her skin, a physical pain to ground the rising tide of nausea. She tucked the key into the pocket of her robe, closed the safe with a soft click, and returned every file to its exact position, her mind already racing toward the dawn. The morning was gray and biting as she parked her car a block away from the post office. The city was just beginning to stir, the first delivery trucks rumbling through the streets. Inside the lobby, the smell of cheap adhesive and wet cardboard was overwhelming. She found the row of gray metal boxes, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slid the key into lock 402. It turned with a dry, mechanical screech. Inside sat a thick wedge of envelopes, bound tightly with a thick rubber band. She pulled them out, her eyes widening as she saw the logos. These weren't from their usual bank. They were from a high-interest credit firm and a private wealth management group she didn't recognize. Every single one was addressed to Ben. The floor beneath her seemed to liquefy. She leaned against the sorting counter, her vision blurring as she stared at the stack. She looked around, certain that every person entering the lobby could see the guilt and terror written on her face. She shoved the mail into her large tote bag, pressing it against her ribs as if she could keep the truth from leaking out. Back in the sanctuary of her car, she locked the doors, the windows quickly fogging from her ragged breathing. She tore open the first envelope. The paper crunched, a violent sound in the small space. Her eyes lunged at the numbers, rows of figures with 5 zeros, all highlighted in bold black ink. These weren't investment gains. These were lines of credit, maxed out to the breaking point. She ripped into the second, the third, the fourth. It was a ledger of ruin. Enormous sums had been siphoned out of their primary savings and moved into these shadow accounts, only to disappear into discretionary spending. Her breathing became a series of short, panicked gasps. The condensation on the windshield turned the world outside into a smear of gray and green, trapping her in a small, cold cockpit of revelation. The white paper in her lap felt like a death warrant. She pulled a pen from her purse, her hand shaking so violently she had to grip her wrist to steady it. She began to underline the dates of the largest withdrawals. A pattern emerged, a map of betrayal. A $50,000 transfer occurred on the very day Ben had taken her out for an anniversary dinner, toasted to their golden future, and told her the investments were doubling. Another 30,000 vanished the week she had asked about the roof repairs, when he had told her they needed to stay liquid for a big market move. The recipients were a series of shell companies and private accounts with names that meant nothing to her. Their life's work, the slow, patient accumulation of 30 years of labor, had been bled dry. She felt a surge of physical sickness. The realization that every meal they'd shared, every vacation they'd taken, had been a charade performed on a stage of debt. She struck the steering wheel with her fist, but the sound was hollow, a pathetic thump against the magnitude of the lie. Ben's voice echoed in her head, promising safety, and now those words tasted like ash. She drove to the shop, but the sight of the colorful fabrics, the carefully curated displays of beauty and tradition, felt like a mockery. The shop was a stage set for a life that no longer existed. She sank onto the stool behind the counter, staring at the empty shelves she had hoped to fill with new inventory. Her world, once as structured and predictable as a quilt block, had been ripped at the seams. The betrayal deepened a few days later, a slow-motion car crash that refused to end. She was looking for a specific tin of buttons in the back of the kitchen pantry when her hand struck a cold, hard object hidden behind a bulk box of oatmeal. She pulled out a sleek, black smartphone. Not Ben's work phone, but a second device, hidden and silent. As she touched it, the screen flared to life, a barrage of notifications illuminating the dark kitchen. It was an endless scroll of gambling alerts. Red numbers flashed. Losses on horse races in Kentucky, failed spreads on European soccer, high-stakes poker rooms. The sums being lost in a single evening were more than she earned in a month of selling quilts. She watched the screen vibrate with a new message. Account overdrawn. Immediate deposit required. Her thumb hovered over the messaging app, a portal she knew she shouldn't open but couldn't resist. The history was a chronicle of a double life. There were messages to a woman named Emily, filled with an intimacy that made Margo feel like a voyeur in her own marriage. She saw photos of a diamond tennis bracelet Ben had bought for this stranger, the receipt scanned and sent with the caption, "A little something for my queen." Margo looked at the date of the receipt. It was the same day she had spent 4 hours on the phone with the utility company, begging for an extension on the shop's electric bill. The walls of the kitchen seemed to pulse, the ceiling lowering until she could barely stand. She was suffocating under the weight of his queen's jewelry. The sound of the front door slamming shut made her jump, the phone nearly slipping from her nerveless fingers. Ben's heavy footsteps echoed on the hardwood, confident and rhythmic. He marched into the kitchen, his face a mask of weary professional success that crumbled the instant he saw the black phone in her hand. He didn't apologize. He didn't stammer. His face turned a dark, bruised purple, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure, predatory aggression. Before she could find her voice, he lunged. His fingers, thick and powerful, clamped around her wrist, twisting with a brutality that forced a cry from her throat. He wrenched the phone away, the force of the movement sending her stumbling back. She hit the edge of the heavy oak kitchen chair, the wood biting into her spine, and collapsed onto the seat. Ben stood over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. He smelled of mint and unwashed adrenaline. "You have no right," he hissed, his voice a low, vibrating growl. "Spying like a common thief in your own house." "My right?" Margo gasped, clutching her bruised wrist. "Ben, the money, the gambling, this woman, Emily. You've destroyed us." He didn't flinch. Instead, he slammed his fist onto the table, the china rattling in the cupboards. He pointed a shaking finger toward the window, toward the shop. "Destroyed us? I've been propping up that pathetic little hobby of yours for a decade. That shop is a coffin, Margo. a dusty, dying relic that sucks the life out of everything it touches. I deserved a life. I deserved excitement, not the slow death of watching you sew rags together in a town that forgot we existed 20 years ago. He straightened his back, looking down at her as if she were a stain he couldn't quite scrub out. I'm the one who kept the lights on. I'm the one who made sure you could play dress up with your little blankets. Don't you dare talk to me about betrayal. He turned on his heel and walked out, leaving her in the silence of a kitchen that no longer felt like home. Desperate for a foothold, Margo went to her laptop an hour later, her heart hammering. She needed to see the damage. She needed to know if there was anything left to salvage. She navigated to the bank's login page, her fingers hovering over the keys. She entered the password they had used for years. Access denied. She tried again, slower this time, her eyes burning. Incorrect password. She tried the security questions, her mother's maiden name, the name of their first pet. Answers do not match our records. He had locked her out. He had scrubbed her existence from their shared history with a few clicks of a mouse. She stared at the cold, blue glow of the monitor, the cursor blinking like a mocking heartbeat. She was a ghost in her own life, haunting a house she no longer owned, and a marriage that had been a hollow shell for years. The next morning, the reality of his malice took a physical form. She arrived at the shop to find a man in a sharp, anonymous gray suit standing by the door. He didn't look at her as she approached. With a practiced, indifferent motion, he peeled the backing off a legal document and pressed it firmly against the front window. The sound of the adhesive sticking to the glass was like a bone snapping. Margo read the words. Notice of sequestration. All assets, including machinery, inventory, and fixtures, are hereby frozen pending legal resolution of outstanding liabilities. You can't do this, she said, her voice sounding small and brittle against the morning traffic. This is my family's business. The man finally looked at her, his eyes as cold as the winter sky. Mr. Hensley used the business assets as collateral for a series of personal bridge loans, ma'am. The payments are 4 months overdue. I'm just the messenger. He handed her a carbon copy of the order, the paper smelling of chemical ink and old basements. She walked inside, the bell jingling a mournful note. Her sewing machines, the heavy, reliable Berninas and the vintage Singers, now had yellow inventory tags looped around their handles. They looked like prisoners of war. The social isolation followed with the speed of a contagion. When she walked into the local bakery later that morning, hoping for the comfort of a familiar face, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The group of women by the window, members of her own quilting circle, suddenly found something fascinating in the bottom of their coffee cups. The cheerful chatter died, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. She felt the weight of their judgment, a physical pressure against her chest. In a town like Lancaster, financial ruin was a moral failing, and divorce was a scandal that stained everyone nearby. She caught the baker's eye, a man she had known since high school, and saw only a flicker of pity before he looked away, wiping the counter with unnecessary vigor. As she left the bakery, her heart sank further. She saw Ben across the street, standing near the white picket fence of their neighbor, Mr. Miller. Ben was the picture of a man in mourning. He held his hat in his hands, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in a perfect imitation of a husband burdened by a tragic secret. He was whispering to the old man, gesturing vaguely toward the shop, and then touching his temple in a universal sign of mental instability. He was telling them she was crazy. He was preempting her truth with a lie so pervasive that no one would listen to her when she finally spoke. He was sewing a new story for the town, one where he was the long-suffering saint and she was the erratic, aging woman who had lost her grip on reality. The final blow came in the sterile, wood-paneled office of a cut-rate attorney Ben had hired to handle the separation. The man looked at Margo through thick spectacles, his voice a monotonous drone. "Mrs. Hensley, the post-nuptial agreement you signed 5 years ago, during the restructuring of the business, is quite clear. It grants your husband full power of attorney regarding the commercial property in the event of operational instability. Given the current debt load, he has exercised his right to liquidate the building to satisfy the creditors." Margo stared at the document he pushed toward her. There was her signature, shaky and hopeful, from a time when she thought she was helping Ben protect their future. "This building has been in my family for 3 generations, she said, her voice cracking. "My grandfather laid the floorboards." "The law doesn't care about floorboards, ma'am," the lawyer said, not unkindly. "It cares about signatures. The auction is set for the 15th. She returned to the shop to find Ben already there. He wasn't mourning now. He was a whirlwind of destruction. He was throwing rolls of antique silk, fabrics she had searched for in 3 states, into heavy cardboard boxes. He was crushing the delicate lace, the hand-dyed linens, with a callousness that made her stomach turn. "Stop it!" she cried, rushing toward him. "You're ruining them!" He didn't even look up. He was busy slapping clearance stickers onto her finished quilts, marking them down to a fraction of their value. "I'm turning dead weight into cash, Margo. It's what should have been done years ago." The sound of the packing tape screeching off the roll was a scream that echoed through the empty store, a sound that signaled the end of everything she had ever known. The following week was a blur of gray light and the metallic taste of fear. Margo moved through her house like a stranger, avoiding the rooms where Ben's presence still loomed. The air in the house had become toxic, a heavy, airless environment where every floorboard creak felt like a threat. It came to a head on a Tuesday afternoon. Margo was behind the counter of the shop, trying to organize the chaos Ben had left behind, when the door opened. Ben didn't enter. He invaded. He marched to the counter and slapped a thick blue folder onto the wood. The notice of dissolution was printed in a font that seemed designed to humiliate. "Sign it," he said, his voice flat and devoid of the easy charm he used on the neighbors. "I've already moved my things to the apartment in town. I want this settled before the auction." Margo looked at the papers, then up at him. "The apartment you're sharing with Emily?" His eyes flashed with a momentary spark of rage, but he suppressed it. "Where I live is no longer your concern. What is your concern is that you have 48 hours to vacate this building. I've sold the remaining inventory to a liquidator from Philly. They'll be here Thursday morning." "You can't sell my quilts, Ben. Those are commissions. Those belong to families. They belong to the estate," he countered, stepping behind the counter into her space. He reached for her hand, not with affection, but with a predatory focus. "And I'll have those keys now." "No," Margo said, her voice trembling but firm. She clutched the heavy brass ring in her pocket. Ben didn't hesitate. He grabbed her wrist, his strength overwhelming hers in an instant. He twisted her arm behind her back, a sharp, white-hot pain lancing through her shoulder. She gasped, her knees buckling. He reached into her pocket, his breath hot against her ear, and wrenched the keys away. The metal ring tore against the skin of her palm, leaving a jagged, stinging welt that immediately began to bead with blood. He shoved her away, and she stumbled, her back hitting the cold cast-iron frame of her grandmother's Singer sewing machine. The machine groaned under her weight, a mournful sound of old metal. Ben held the keys up, a glint of triumph in his eyes. "Thursday morning, Margo. Be out or I'll have the sheriff remove you." He walked out, locking the front door from the outside, leaving her trapped in the darkened shop. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in her throat. She looked at the blood on her palm, then at the rows of quilts that were her life's work. She couldn't let him do this. She couldn't let him turn her life into a line item in a bankruptcy filing. She ran to the back of the shop, to the small supply room. She found a roll of heavy white butcher paper and a thick black marker. Her hands were shaking, the blood from her palms smearing the edges of the paper. But she didn't care. She began to write. Knot of open hearts. Thursday, 7 p.m. The truth behind the seams. She spent the night in the shop, sleeping on a pile of unfinished batting. At dawn, she used the back exit, a door Ben had forgotten to lock, and began her rounds. She pinned the flyers to the community board at the grocery store, tucked them under the windshield wipers of cars at the church, and handed them to every woman she recognized on the street. The whispers followed her. Did you see her? She looks terrible. Ben was right. She's lost it. But Margo didn't stop. She was sowing something new now, a pattern of survival that required every bit of her strength. Thursday evening arrived with a biting wind that rattled the windows of the shop. Margo had spent the day preparing. She had cleared the center of the floor, arranging the remaining quilts in a semicircle like a colorful jury. She had set up a small table with tea and the last of her grandmother's china. At 6:55, the shop was empty. The silence was a physical weight. Then the bell jingled. It was Mrs. Miller, the oldest resident of the street, her face unreadable. Then came Sarah, then Anna, then two more women from the quilting circle. They entered tentatively, their faces tight with a mix of curiosity and dread. Margo stood in the center of the room, her hand bandaged, her back straight. She didn't wait for them to sit. She began to speak. She told them everything. She didn't use the soft, careful words of a victim. She spoke with the precision of a master tailor. She showed them the gambling logs. She showed them the photos of Emily's jewelry. She showed them the bank statements that proved Ben had been stealing from the shop for years. "He told you I was crazy," Margo said, her voice ringing out in the small space. "He told you I was the reason we were failing. But look at these stitches. Do these look like the work of a woman who has lost her mind?" The women were silent, their eyes darting between the documents and the quilts. The air in the room shifted, the coldness of judgment melting into the heat of shared outrage. The door burst open. Ben stood there, his face contorted with a fury that made several women gasp. He looked at the flyers, then at the documents in their hands. "What is this?" he roared, marching toward Margo. "I told you to be out of here. This is a private auction." "It's a public accounting, Ben," Margo said, her heart racing but her voice steady. He lunged for her, his hand raised as if to strike her down in front of everyone. "Shut up! You're finished!" But he never reached her. Mrs. Miller stepped forward, her heavy wooden cane thudding against the floorboards. Then Sarah moved, then Anna. Within seconds, a wall of women stood between Margo and her husband. They didn't say a word. They simply stood there, a solid phalanx of wool coats and determined faces. Ben stopped, his chest heaving, his eyes darting around the room. He saw the judgment in their eyes, not for Margo, but for him. He saw the documents they held like weapons. He saw the sheriff's deputy standing at the back of the room, who had slipped in unnoticed. He realized, in that moment, that he had lost the town. The story he had sown had unraveled in a single night. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the keys, and threw them at Margo's feet. "Take the damn building," he spat, his voice cracking with humiliation. "It's a tomb anyway." He turned and fled into the night, the sound of his boots on the gravel fading into the distance. The room remained silent for a long time. Then, a young woman in the back, a tourist who had wandered in out of curiosity, held up her phone. "I got the whole thing on video," she whispered. "The world needs to see this." By the next morning, the video had gone viral. The quilter of Lancaster became a symbol of resilience for women across the country. Orders began to pour in, not for clearance items, but for custom work, for quilts of truth. The legal battle was long and grueling. Ben tried to fight the property transfer, but Margot's lawyer discovered a forgotten clause in her grandfather's original deed. The land could only be sold with the unanimous consent of all living descendants, and Margo had never signed a formal waiver for the auction. The operational instability clause Ben had relied on was overridden by the ancestral protections of the deed. Margo sat in her shop a month later, the morning sun once again painting the floorboards in gold. The smell of fresh coffee and lavender was back, but there was something else now. The hum of 3 new, state-of-the-art machines, paid for by a crowdfunding campaign started by the women of the town. She looked at her laptop. The Blankets of Hope platform was live, connecting her with hundreds of women who wanted to learn her craft. The shop was no longer just a store. It was a sanctuary, a place where the broken pieces of lives were sewn back together into something stronger and more beautiful than they had been before. She walked to the front door and looked at the new sign. Hensley's Heritage. Her name, alone and proud. She inhaled the crisp Lancaster air, feeling the strength in her hands and the peace in her heart. The old life was gone, torn to shreds by a man who didn't understand the value of a single, honest stitch. But from those rags, she had made a masterpiece. And for the first time in 52 years, Margo Hensley knew exactly who she was.